Park County, Colorado, September 1882. The silver boom had turned Leadville into a city of 30,000. Every miner who struck a vein was building a frame mansion with gingerbread trim and ordering wallpaper from Chicago. The mountains were full of pine, the mills were running day and night, and a man could buy enough sawn lumber for a 2-room cabin for $80 cash. Nobody with any ambition was living in anything less. And then a failed prospector named Ezekiel Morrow hauled his tools to a patch of south-facing slope on the edge of the Mosquito Range and announced he was building a house out of stones, mud, and dirt. Total cash outlay, $9.40. He called it a cabin. The miners in Elma called it Morrow's Mole Hole. They laughed about it in the assay office and at the general store. Morse might have missed his silver, they said, but he sure found himself a pile of rocks. But Ezekiel Morrow hadn't missed anything. He'd spent 3 years prospecting above timberline and another 2 working as a carpenter's helper in a frame house crew. And he'd noticed something that every miner living in a pine board shack complained about every winter. The frame houses were cold. The wind blew straight through the walls. The stoves had to be fed all night, and the hillside itself, the raw material under everyone's feet, sat at a steady 45 degrees while the air outside dropped to 40 below. Morrow didn't need silver. He needed a house that understood thermodynamics. In this video, we're going to uncover the forgotten design that made a $10 stone and earth cabin warmer than any modern home in the Rockies, the specific construction tricks that made it work, and the reason this 1882 relic outsmarted houses that cost 100 times more. Ezekiel Morrow was not an architect. He was a 36-year-old former carpenter from upstate New York who'd come west in 1877 with gold rush fever and a talent for reading the landscape that most prospectors lacked. He never hit a major vein. What he found instead, while camping in a rock shelter during a September snowstorm at 11,000 feet, was that the ground beneath an overhang held its temperature with almost no fluctuation. He slept against the back wall of that shelter, wrapped in a single wool blanket, and woke warm while the storm raged outside. The rock was not warm in the way a stove is warm, but it was not cold either. It was neutral, steady, a presence of stillness in a world of howling wind. Morrow filed the lesson away. When a mining company bought his claim for a modest sum in the spring of 1882, he had $300 and no interest in spending most of it on a frame house that would leak heat all winter and roast all summer. He bought a mule, a pick, a shovel, a level, a trowel, and a used crosscut saw. He bought 2 small windows from a Leadville salvage yard for 50 cents apiece. He bought a second-hand cast-iron stove for $5 and a length of stovepipe for $2. The remaining $9.40 went to nails, hinges, and a door latch. The house itself would cost him nothing but labor and the rocks scattered across his 40 acres. The site he chose was a south-facing slope at 9,200 feet, sheltered from the northwest wind by a granite outcrop. The spot received full winter sun from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, even on the shortest day of the year. That was the first piece of thermal engineering. A south-facing window in winter at that latitude receives roughly 1,000 BTUs of solar energy per square foot per clear day. A window the size of a small door, say 3 feet by 4 feet, catches about 12,000 BTUs of free heat on a sunny January afternoon. That's the equivalent of burning a cord of dry pine in a month, entering the house without a match. Morrow dug into the slope, excavating a level bench 6 feet back into the hillside. The rear wall of the cabin would not be exposed to the air at all. It would be the hill itself, cut clean and faced with stone. The floor would sit 4 feet below grade, bringing the living space into contact with the deep earth temperature of 45 degrees. In winter, that 45 degrees is a heat source. In summer, it's a heat sink. The hillside was the engine, and Morrow knew it without using the word geothermal. The walls he laid up from rounded glacial stones collected from the slope, each roughly the size of a human head, mortared together with a thick paste of clay subsoil and water. This was not the weak mud mortar of a hurried job. Murrow had learned from a mason in New York that a proper clay mortar, mixed to the consistency of putty and packed tight, would dry to a density approaching soft brick. He laid the stones in courses, flattening the bed of each with extra clay and driving smaller chinking stones into the joints. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top plate. 2 feet of stone and clay has a thermal mass of roughly 300 pounds per square foot of wall area. That mass absorbs heat during the day and releases it over the following 12 to 16 hours, creating a thermal lag that shifts the temperature peak from mid-afternoon to the middle of the night, exactly when a family sleeping under blankets needs the warmth most. The west wall was the same. The east wall was the same. The south wall held the 2 salvaged windows and the door, recessed into the thick stone and sheltered by a small overhang Morrow built from poles and packed earth, a design known today as an eyebrow dormer over the entry. The north wall, the back of the cabin, was the hillside itself, faced with stone on the interior but buried on the outside under 8 vertical feet of soil and rock. The wind could blow 30 below against that buried face and never touch the living space inside. The temperature of the earth at 8 feet deep never drops below 40 degrees in a Colorado winter, regardless of what the air above is doing. The cabin didn't fight the cold. It was wrapped in a constant 40-degree blanket that consumed no fuel and never failed. The roof was the most unconventional detail. Murrow laid peeled pine poles side by side from the front wall to the hillside, covered them with a layer of oiled canvas, then stacked 18 inches of soil and gravel on top, tamped firm and planted with native buffalo grass. A green roof, though he never heard the term. The soil load added structural weight, which he compensated for with a center beam supported by a stone pillar inside, but it also added an enormous additional thermal mass above the living space. In summer, that living sod shaded the roof from direct sun and transpired moisture, cooling the cabin through evaporative loss, just like the wet canvas method the mountain men used for meat storage. In winter, the soil roof acted as a thick, insulating cap, holding the stove's heat inside rather than letting it radiate into the cold night sky. The ceiling underneath was just 7 feet high, keeping the heated air where people actually sat instead of rising to waste. The interior was one room, 12 feet by 16, a packed earth floor smoothed with a slurry of clay and linseed oil until it was hard and slightly shiny. A single stove against the north wall, sharing the thermal mass of the hillside. 2 small windows placed high enough on the south wall to catch winter sun, but shaded by the overhang in summer when the sun tracked higher. A heavy wooden door with leather hinges and no air leaks. The total living volume was roughly 1,300 cubic feet. A modern single-wide trailer has 5 to 6 times that volume, meaning 5 to 6 times the amount of air a heating appliance has to warm. Morrow's cabin was small not because he couldn't afford bigger, but because he understood that heating space you don't use is the fastest way to burn through your entire wood pile. The construction took him 4 months of solitary labor. He laid the last stone in November as the first snow began to fall. The cash cost remained $9.40. At the Leadville lumberyard around the same time, the cheapest kit-built cabin with single-wall pine construction, tar paper roof, and no insulation was selling for $110. Morrow's cabin cost less than 1/10 of that and was built to outlast it by a century. The ridicule began before the mortar was dry. Miners riding past would stop and stare. They saw a low, dark mound of rocks and dirt with 2 tiny windows peeking out like a badger's eyes. They called it the mole hole. They said Morrow had finally lost his mind from too much time above timberline. A fellow named Silas Crane, no relation to the quartermaster at Fort Buford, but equally practical, stopped by in October and asked Morrow why he was living like a troll when he had money for a real house. "Real houses are cold," Morrow said. "They're houses. This is a burrow." "We'll see in January." January came. The winter of 1882 to 83 was a hard one in the Colorado high country. The temperature at Leadville dropped to 38 below zero on the 9th of January and stayed below zero for 17 consecutive days. The wind scoured the Arkansas Valley at 40 and 50 miles an hour, piling drifts to the eaves of the frame cabins on Main Street. Inside those frame cabins, conditions were miserable. Single-wall pine, even with tar paper backing, has an R value of roughly 1.5 per inch of thickness. A standard 1-inch board wall offers an R value of about 1.5. That means heat passes through it almost as fast as the stove can produce it. The miners in Leadville were burning cord after cord of split pine, stoking their stoves every hour, and still waking to water buckets frozen solid 3 feet from the fire. The average indoor temperature in the Leadville frame cabin that January, according to a weather diary kept by the postmaster, was 44 degrees during the day and 27 at night in the corners farthest from the stove. Families slept in their coats. Children did their lessons wrapped in blankets. At Ezekiel Morrow's mole hole, the scene was different. On the morning of January 9th, with the outside temperature at 38 below, the thermometer on Morrow's windowsill read 61 degrees. He'd burned half a cord of wood in the preceding month. The stove was a small one, meant for a parlor, and he fed it 3 split logs in the morning and 3 in the evening. The walls, the floor, the buried north face, and the soil roof were doing the work of a furnace. A neighbor named Tom Birch, whose frame cabin a mile down the gulch was at 33 degrees and falling, rode up to Morrow's place to see for himself. He found Morrow sitting at a handmade table in his shirt sleeves, reading an old copy of the Denver Tribune by the light of one of the small windows. The stove was barely ticking over. The air was warm and still, without the drafts that plagued Birch's cabin at every corner and joint. "How?" Birch asked. "Stone holds heat," Morrow said. "Dirt holds heat. The hill holds heat. All I'm doing is keeping it in." Birch put his hand on the interior stone wall. It was warm to the touch, not the cold shock of pine boards. The wall had absorbed heat from the stove and from the sun through the south windows and was radiating it back into the room in a steady, invisible current. The thermal mass of that wall, roughly 14,000 pounds of stone and clay, had the heat capacity to store about 200,000 BTUs for a 10-degree temperature rise. A small wood stove produces roughly 50,000 BTUs per hour on a moderate burn. In the course of a day, the stove and the sun could load the wall with heat, which the wall would then release over the next 12 to 16 hours, smoothing out the temperature curve so completely that the fire could die completely at midnight and the room would still be at 55 degrees at dawn. This is the principle of the Trombe wall, a passive solar technique formalized by French engineer Félix Trombe in the 1960s. Ezekiel Morrow had never heard the name, but he had built one out of instinct and glacial stone. Word spread slowly through the gulch. The miners who'd called it the mole hole stopped laughing. A few rode up to sit in the warm room and ask questions. Morrow answered all of them plainly. He had no secret methods, no proprietary formula. He told anyone who asked exactly how he'd built it. Dig into the hill, face south, make the walls thick, put dirt on the roof, use small windows placed high, and let the earth do the work. It cost nothing in materials and everything in labor, but labor was the one thing a failed prospector had in abundance. The following summer, 2 other men in the area built cabins on similar principles. One, a Swedish immigrant named Lundquist, built a stone broomed house into a south-facing bank and reported the following winter that he never saw the inside temperature drop below 58 while burning a third of the wood his old frame house had consumed. The other, a former cavalryman named Royce, built a low, sod-roofed cabin with stone walls 2.5 feet thick and called it the best quarters he'd ever wintered in. Neither cabin cost more than $25 in purchased materials. Both are still standing, partially ruined now, embedded in the landscape like the outcrops they were made from. Morrow himself lived in his cabin for 19 years. He and his wife, a schoolteacher from Fairplay named Alice, raised 2 daughters in the single room. The girls slept in a loft he added above the stove, where the warmest air collected naturally. Alice kept house in the stone room and never once complained of the cold, even during the winter of 1899, when the temperature at Leadville dropped to 50 below and the railroad shut down for 2 weeks. The Morrow cabin held at 55 degrees, with the stove on low and the family eating meals around a single oil lamp. That winter, 3 frame cabins in the gulch were abandoned because their owners couldn't keep them warm enough to inhabit. The mole hole outlasted them all. In 1910, a young architect from Denver named William Stickley read about Morrow's cabin in a feature article published by the Colorado Historical Society. Stickley was fascinated by the design and visited the site with a notebook and a camera. He wrote up his observations in a small pamphlet titled The Thermal House, a Study in Native Stone Construction, which circulated among architects interested in what was then called the earth-sheltered movement. The pamphlet noted that the Morrow cabin achieved a thermal performance that modern homes of the era, with their thin walls and central heating, could not match without enormous fuel consumption. Stickley calculated that the cabin's effective insulation value, accounting for thermal mass and earth sheltering, was the equivalent of an R40 wall in a conventional frame house, a figure that wouldn't become common in American home construction until the 1980s and would still require synthetic foam insulation to achieve. The $10 cabin had outsmarted modern homes by 80 years. The principles Ezekiel Morrow applied are the same ones that passive house architects use today. Orient the long axis south, put the majority of the glazing on the south wall, use high thermal mass materials in the envelope, shelter the north face with earth, keep the ceiling low to reduce heated volume, design the roof overhang to shade the windows in summer and admit sun in winter. Use a compact floor plan to minimize surface area to volume ratio. Those rules are now taught in sustainable design programs as if they are innovations. They are not innovations. They are the accumulated knowledge of people who froze in frame houses and figured out why. Modern labs have tested the performance of stone and earth walls and found that a 2-foot-thick stone wall with clay mortar has a thermal lag of 8 to 10 hours and can store roughly 30 to 40 BTUs per square foot per degree Fahrenheit of temperature rise. When you couple that with direct solar gain through south-facing glass, the wall acts as a radiant heater that releases heat precisely when the house needs it most. There is no moving part, no ductwork, no fuel consumption. The cost of the system is built into the walls at the time of construction. Morrow's $9.40 bought him a radiant heating system that operated maintenance-free for 19 years. The cabin itself did not survive the 20th century. A mining company bought the land in 1927 and bulldozed the structure to build a tramway. The stones were scattered, the hillside was graded, but the memory of what Morrow built was already in print, in Stickley's pamphlet, and in the minds of a few builders who still understood that a well-placed rock and a south-facing window can outperform a furnace. During the energy crisis of the 1970s, a new generation of passive solar builders rediscovered those same pamphlets and built earth-sheltered homes that kept families warm through oil embargoes with no more fuel than a cord or two of wood. The lineage runs unbroken from the Anasazi cliff dwellings to the Mandan earth lodges to Amos Selkirk's 3-foot sod walls to Ezekiel Morrow's stone cabin in the Mosquito Range. The materials change, but the physics does not. What makes the Morrow cabin genuinely remarkable is not that it worked, it's that it worked better than the houses the miners in Leadville were paying 30 times more to freeze in. The frame cabins of the 1880s were advertised as modern, progressive, and civilized. They looked like the houses back east. They had sawn boards, glass windows, and painted trim. And they were thermal sieves that consumed wood by the wagon load and still couldn't hold 50 degrees in a Colorado winter. Morrow's mole hole, built for less than the price of a single miner's suit of clothes, was warmer, quieter, and sturdier by every relevant measure. It outsmarted modern homes because modern homes had forgotten what the hillside knew all along. The lesson is sitting in the physics waiting for anyone who needs it. A thick wall holds heat. A south window catches sun. A buried roof keeps the cold where it belongs. Build small, build heavy, build into the earth. Those are not primitive ideas. They're the most sophisticated thermal engineering on the continent, and they cost almost nothing but the time it takes to stack one stone on another and watch what the sun does. Ezekiel Morrow figured it out with a pick, a shovel, and $9. The rest of us have been catching up ever since. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and have you ever been inside a house made of stone or earth that stayed warm without a furnace? Hit that subscribe button for one forgotten building technique every week. And hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the difference between a house that looks modern and one that actually works. Because the smartest home on the mountain might be the one that looks like the mountain itself.